Hi, this is Hillary Clinton,
Hi, this is Chelsea Clinton.
and we are thrilled that you've joined us on this Facebook Live event where we're going to be talking about the book that Chelsea and I wrote. It's called The Book of Gutsy Women. I mean, here it is. We're signing copies as we talk, and we're going to answer your questions. And we are helped by our wonderful friend and collaborator, Lauren Peterson, who you will get to know during this time. And we just had the most extraordinary experience picking out these incredible women. These are some of our favorite stories of courage and resilience. You can dip in and out of it when you need a little inspiration to keep going. And we use these stories ourselves.
And some of them I have grown up with and have known for as long as I can remember, including the stories of my grandmothers that we share. Some of the stories were brought into my life thanks to teachers, and they're stories that I'm already starting to share with my children. So we hope that you enjoy them, and we're looking forward to answering your questions. Lauren, do you want to kick us off?
I sure do. Hi, everybody. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we will be signing books. You can get a copy for yourself, or they make a great gift by going to premiercollectibles.com/gutsywomen, and you'll also have the chance to submit a question. So we've got a few audience questions coming in already, and I have to say they are great. But to kick things off, Madam Secretary and Chelsea, I know this is the first book that you two have written together, and the finished product I know was no small undertaking. So pulling together more than 100 stories of gutsy women, how do you even start?
You know, Lauren, we had a hard time because there were so many women that we wanted to write about. We could have written, like a 100-pound book, which would have been ridiculous and, never to be done. But what we did was starting off to make long lists of all the women that we wanted to write about. Then we had to cut it down. We wrote over 200 essays, and then, boy, did we have a challenge cutting it down to the 103 that are in the book. But as Chelsea said, some of these stories were of women who I encountered as a young girl, either through reading books and magazines or on TV or at school. And Chelsea had a similar experience, but then we also traded the names of women who we found particularly inspirational at different points of our lives. And then we had the hard task of cutting it down to 103.
Which was really challenging, although I think my mom and I are both incredibly grateful to our editors for their just relentless advice, which was sometimes painful to hear but necessary, that no one would read the book if it were kind of too encyclopedic.
That's fair. So here's a great question from Trevor in Portland, Oregon, who wants to know, both of you have written books before, but this is your first book together. So what was your favorite part of working together?
Well, the favorite part of working together was working together because this book came out of conversations that Chelsea and I have been having since she was a little girl. And it was in response to little kids, mostly little girls, coming up to us in all kinds of settings, sometimes book signings for Chelsea's children's books or other events where little girls would say something like, who were your heroes? Who did you look up to? So Chelsea and I just began talking about how common it was for us to be asked that by children. And I don't know, the idea just kind of popped up that maybe we should share some stories that really build on Chelsea's children's book. Mm-hmm. She persisted, both in the United States and around the world, which was so amazing in introducing little kids to incredible women. But, this book is a kind of more, teenage and up version of that.
I think one of my favorite parts of working with my mom was both kind of revisiting stories that had meant so much to me, particularly as a little girl. So whether my grandmothers or ballerinas that had really inspired me, or kind of remembering when my mom took me to go see Jerry Ferraro when she came to Little Rock. And then kind of reflecting on how many of those stories really influenced me, Lauren, in ways that I wasn't aware of at the time, but kind of that just steady drumbeat of the need to kind of persist and be resilient and stay true to your purpose. And I just am so thankful that I had a mom who believed it was so important that I grow up surrounded by gutsy women, sometimes kind of in my own life in a day-to-day sense, and sometimes through the stories that she would share.
And that's true not only for little girls, but for little boys too. We want everybody to read this book, and the women in it, there are a few fictional characters who inspired us. There are obviously historical women from history, but there are a lot of contemporary women, including young women who, like Greta Thunberg, have made such a big impression already in our lives.
And I have to ask, we have a question from Jacob in Sweden that actually has been on my mind too. How excited are the two of you, speaking of fictional women, for the new Little Women movie?
I'm very excited about it because Little Women had a big impression on me when I was growing up, and I think it's an evergreen tale, and it should be reintroduced at different points of time, and now with young actresses from today playing the roles, it has a new meaning that I think is important today as it was 50, 60, 100 years ago.
I'm definitely going to be thinking about my grandmother because she loved the book, and she also, I think it's one of the few books that she really enjoyed seeing different versions of, like she wasn't just attached to the version from the 1930s, like she really appreciated the version that came out in the 90s and kind of all those that came in between, and so I'm really excited to see it, and I'm really excited to try to imagine what my grandmother would think of the newest iteration of Little Women.
And you mentioned, you two write in the book about the fact that you had sort of a book club of 3 with your mom, Secretary Clinton, your grandmother. Can you tell us about some of the books that you read in that book club? What was that like?
Oh my gosh. Well, I loved learning from my grandmother and with my grandmother and laughing with my grandmother. And we got to do kind of all of that a lot through books we read. It really started with the Elizabeth Peters, Amelia Peabody series. And I found, I think, what was the second book in the series at a secondhand bookstore in Ohio, actually during the 2008 campaign. And I'd finished my book, and I think there was a delayed flight, and I was looking for something to read, and I picked up this book, and it just kind of it invited me into what is still one of my most favorite series of all times. Amelia Peabody is kind of this fictionalized version of kind of early female archaeologists, and Elizabeth Peters was the pen name of Barbara Mertz, who was one of the first women actually to get a PhD in archaeology, and she wrote a series of scholarly works that my grandmother and I ultimately read too, that we didn't understand as much as her kind of fictional stories, but that then kind of led to just a love of sharing books and trading books and kind of our book club of 3, but really we have to give credit to Amelia Peabody.
I love that.
Yeah, it was, my mother was a great reader. She had very broad tastes in reading, which she introduced to me and then to Chelsea. And one thing she did was to keep all of the original Nancy Drew books that I had gotten for like birthdays or Christmas during the time I was reading Nancy Drew, back in the 1950s. And she kept them, and then she gifted them to Chelsea. So Chelsea got to read the original Nancy Drew. And in the book, we note that this fictional 16-year-old character influenced everybody from Sonia Sotomayor to Gayle King. People who in their adult years, when asked, like, well, where did you get inspiration to think you could be a Supreme Court justice or you could be a TV anchor, one of the people they mention is Nancy Drew, and we had exactly the same experience.
That's so great. And for those tuning in, if you would like to get a signed copy, if you have a question you'd like to ask, you can go to premiercollectibles.com/gutsywomen, and that's premiere with an E at the end, and keep those questions coming. We've got some great ones. Here's a good one. Chelsea, I know you and I kind of share a soft spot for children's books about gutsy women, and in fact, as we talked about, you have written several of your own. Debbie in Alabama wonders if you have any recommendations for children's books on the subject.
Oh, we reference a book that my family just loves called Mary Wears What She Wants, written by Keith Negley, who we were lucky enough to meet last week in Seattle, I think. And it is such a terrific story, and it is about Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, but when she was a little girl, and her determination to wear pants, which was quite a radical decision in her small New York town in the late 1830s and 1840s when she was a little girl. Flash forward, she was a surgeon during the Civil War. She's the only woman to have ever been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor, which I think is a remarkable achievement for her, but a sobering statistic that she's the only woman in American history to have been so recognized. And in her later years after the Civil War, while still practicing medicine, she continued to campaign through the American Dress Reform Society for American women's rights to wear what we want. And Keith's picture book is just such a wonderful story of a really gutsy little girl who changed attitudes in her town and then ultimately changed attitudes across our country.
And of course, I have to mention Chelsea's books because I love them and I read them.
And because you're my mom.
I'm your mom, and I read them to my grandchildren, her children. But she persisted, and she persisted around the world, introduce you to some of the women that are in the book, but also others who we didn't include this time. But it's beautifully illustrated, and we saw the illustrator.
Alexandra, who is just so talented.
Yep.
And a magician, I think, with illustrations.
And then I also really liked your last book, which is not about this subject, but about a subject that is important. Don't Let Them Disappear, about endangered species, because we have several women who were groundbreaking environmentalists, conservationists, people who discovered lots of important things about animals, Jane Goodall, for example. But the linkage so that children can know that there were women who were on the front lines of trying to save species and save our environment, save our planet, and then to break it down to let little kids know about it too.
That's
we all
great.
can do. Yeah.
So this is a question I think that probably every woman in this book could answer, which is from Solange in St. Louis, who wants to know, have the bullies ever shaken your confidence? And if so, going out on a limb, assuming that may have happened, what was your remedy for that?
Well, it's interesting because, both Chelsea and I have had to deal with bullies. When we were little girls, I lived in a neighborhood when I was about 4 where every time I went outside, I'd get knocked to the ground. I'd get, taunted and yelled at and run back inside. And finally, after I did that over and over again, practically every day, my mother would dress me up and tell me to go outside and play with the other kids. And then finally, one day when I ran back in crying, which was what I did every day, she met me and she said, "There's no room for cowards in this house. You have to go back outside." I honestly thought that was like the end of my life. I had no idea. Now, she later told me she hid behind, the drapes and peered out the window to see what would happen. The only people more surprised than I was when I went back outside was the kids who were there waiting. They thought they'd gotten rid of me for the day. So I went back out, and because I stood up for myself and because I did go back out, and I found that standing up for yourself meant that, the bullying stopped and actually friendship started. So I've had experiences off and on throughout my life. Actually, you might recall, I had an encounter with a bully in 2016 that we're still seeing the results of. So you have to learn how to be brave and to stand up, not just for yourself, but oftentimes we see somebody else being bullied, and a kind word, a word of support at that time for somebody at school, somebody in the workplace, is also really significant.
I couldn't agree more. And I think we all get discouraged. And I think it's okay to recognize that we all get discouraged. It's just in the challenge of how we get back up again, and how we get back up again in a way that is courageous and resilient, but not calcified or hard. Because we don't want to, I think, like, make ourselves invulnerable. We still want to be kind of vulnerable to the people who have our best interests at heart, the people who love us and we love. But we do want to be strong and resistant to the bullying so that we can lead the lives that we want. And finding that balance, I think, is something that is probably true for every woman, whether you're in the public eye or not.
And I just would say a word about the book, because I think it's fair to say that I would say probably all, but certainly nearly all of the women featured in this book have been bullied. They've been insulted. They've been threatened. Some in very physical ways, thrown into prison and tortured. Some online, like Shannon Watts, who began Moms Demand Action to try to get sensible gun safety legislation passed. So they've all confronted that. And that's why we hope the book serves as inspiration about how others have been knocked down or bullied and then gotten back up and kept going.
Absolutely. So for those of you just tuning in, you can go to premiercollectibles.com/gutsywomen to buy your own signed copy of this fabulous book and ask a question if you'd like. Speaking of some of these women and what they've faced, it really strikes me that a lot of the stories in the book are just so painfully relevant. You have Barbara Jordan during the impeachment process. You have, Daisy Bates being targeted for her civil rights activism. Was that something that you consciously thought about as you were writing, or did it just more start to emerge as you thought about the women?
That's a great question, Lauren. It became a conscious choice for me because literally there are so many gutsy women, and every one of them deserves to be recognized and appreciated. But I think in this time in which we're living through, it's important to think about some of the big challenges we face and how others have confronted them. So you mentioned Barbara Jordan. I was on the impeachment inquiry staff back in 1974, and I was just a very young lawyer working on the law and the facts and the constitutional standards for impeachment. Well, we're going through that again in our country, and I would argue that our founders put the impeachment clause in just for the kind of issues that are being raised in this investigation of our current president. And Barbara Jordan defended the Constitution when she made her remarks in favor of the articles of impeachment against Richard Nixon. Daisy Bates, a civil rights activist in Arkansas, was one of the principal adults who guided the Little Rock Nine, the 9 black students who integrated Central High School. She confronted all kinds of threats. A cross was burned on her front yard. The newspaper she and her husband ran was boycotted, and the advertising, basically dried up. Or Margaret Chase Smith, a woman Republican senator from Maine, who stood up to Joseph McCarthy and basically said the Republican Party should be ashamed that they are not ostracizing this man who is causing so much heartbreak and damage to individual lives and to our country as a whole. So yes, there certainly were points of relevance. Like, how can we talk about global climate change without talking about some of the women who were on the forefront, like Wangari Maathai, a Kenyan woman who planted trees, and by the end of her life had been responsible for 50 million trees being planted across Africa. So yeah, we think there are personal lessons, but also social and political lessons as well.
Absolutely. So, Chelsea, this is something that you write about in the book, and honestly, I just haven't been able to stop thinking about this line that you wrote. And Lori wonders, from Virginia, what common trait do you see among gutsy women?
Well, I think we see a few common traits, actually. I think we see kind of women who are just resolute in their purpose. And I think for so many women, there really is this sense of kind of being called to do something, whether it's in athletics or the arts or academics or politics, activism. And I think that there's also this recognition. I think for some it was part of that purpose, and for others it came later, that what they were doing, wasn't only for themselves. And I think for some of the women, there was that sense of kind of bringing others along kind of from the beginning. And for others, it was kind of a growing recognition that what they were doing was important for their own lives, but also for the lives of others.
Absolutely.
I would add one more trait that Chelsea and I have talked about too, and that is optimism, hopefulness, but really optimism that what you did would make a difference, that people would listen, they would change, circumstances would improve. Because it's hard to be gutsy day after day after day if you don't believe what you're doing can make a difference. And as Chelsea said, to make a difference in your own life, maybe the life of your family and community, but also on a larger scale, influence change in a positive direction.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and I think such a common thread through the stories of these women. So here's a question from Colt in Utah, who wants to know, as a gay man who won't have a mother for his children, how can I best teach my children about women's issues?
Oh, that's a great question.
Well, I think by sharing stories of women in your own life, Colt, that you find inspiring and gutsy, by sharing stories of women who you may encounter through the pages of our book or otherwise, that you think it's important for your daughters and your sons to know. Because certainly, as the mother of a little girl and 2 little boys, I think it's just as important that my sons grow up looking up to, respecting, feeling inspired by, galvanized by gutsy women as it is for my daughter. And I would just say, Colt, the book that I mentioned earlier, Keith Negley's terrific book, was given to my children by one of my gay friends. So I think there are so many stories that you probably know already, and stories that you will find to ensure that your kids know they're so lucky to have you as a dad.
So if you're just tuning in now, if you'd like to join Colt and everyone else who are sending in these fabulous questions, you can go to premiercollectibles.com/gutsywomen, buy an autographed book, especially great if you can't make it out to one of the stops on the book tour. This is your chance to get a signed book, ask your question to these fabulous authors. So this is a tough question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Kath from Nebraska wants to know, what's your favorite story from the book?
Oh boy, that's a hard one. I would be hard pressed, but I will say that wow, I'm particularly impressed by Dr. Hawa Abdi. Dr. Hawa Abdi is a OBGYN doctor who lives in Somalia. And she came from a well enough off family that she got her medical training outside of Somalia, but then she came back to take care of women in her country. And when the conflicts broke out, not only because there was drought and terrible famine that was causing all kinds of conflicts over water and resources, but then when an Islamist jihadist militia called Al-Shabaab got into the picture, there was a lot of fighting and terrible bloodshed and loss. So Dr. Hawa Abdi had a big personal farm, and on the farm, she started sheltering people, mostly women and children who were fleeing the drought, the famine, al-Shabaab, the other militias who were then fighting. So she at one point had 90,000 people living on her farm, and she had to organize them, she had to feed them, she had to try to provide medical care, and she was helped in doing this by two of her daughters who had also become doctors. And then one day, militia members from al-Shabaab showed up and wanted to take over her farm and basically use it as a base to continue their battling others. And she refused. She just flat out said no, no. And she confronted them. They were teenagers with, automatic weapons. And she basically said, what have you ever done for anybody? I'm taking care of people. You should be ashamed of yourselves. And they left, but then they came back, and she went through it again. And the courage, sometimes you don't know how brave you are until you're forced to confront something. She had the means to say, okay, don't hurt anybody, I'm leaving. She could have said that, but she knew if she did, then all these thousands of women and children would be at risk, and she wouldn't do it. She wouldn't leave the people she was sheltering. And I just find that story an incredibly inspiring one, and one that shows us that sometimes in the worst of circumstances, the best of the human spirit shines through.
And I think my favorite stories are my grandmother's stories. The story, though, that I probably think about the most, though, of kind of one of the gutsy women is that of Frady Rice, who is really on the front lines leading the fight against child marriage here in the United States. It is still legal in 48 states for children to be married.
As young as 12.
As young as 12. Thank you, Massachusetts, where that is indeed the minimum marriage age for girls. It's 14 for boys. But when Frady began her work, really motivated kind of by her own experience of having been forced into a marriage and when she was a teenager, and then being raped and abused by her husband, ultimately, thankfully, liberating herself and her two daughters kind of from her abusive situation, and wanting to ensure that no woman and no girl was ever kind of put into a similar horror. There were 50 states where it was still legal for girls to be married. So now, in her home state of New Jersey, it is illegal, no exceptions, for anyone to be married before they turn 18. It's also now true in Delaware, and Frady is going state by state by state. And I've been thinking about kind of this a lot today, because today the Tanzanian Supreme Court ruled that child marriage had to become illegal in Tanzania, that it was a violation of girls' human rights for there to be child marriage. And so I just am so thankful to everyone working around the world to ensure that kind of girls are girls and students, and kind of filled with our own dreams and not brides.
That's amazing. And I think it's so important, too, to look for those spots of good news when they happen, especially now. So here's a question. I think from working on this book with the two of you, it was so clear that you both are just extremely committed to lifting up the women around you and lifting up the women who you've met or heard about whose stories inspire you. And Lori from California wants to know, in what ways do you lift each other up?
Oh, that's a great question, Lori. Well, Chelsea lifts me up all the time by her example, by her being an incredibly hardworking, productive person, her kindness. She's kind, and those of you who follow her on Twitter, she is always trying to turn a negative, nasty comment into, something that shows civility and just a lack of rancor. I think we all need more of that in our lives. And of course, seeing her as a mom, she's such an amazing mother to her 3 kids that I find it really inspiring. And so just her whole being, the kind of person she's turned out to be. She's a gutsy woman, she's a kind woman, a compassionate woman, but a determined, principled woman. So those to me are really the foundations of a good, successful, happy life. And she lifts me up all the time.
I definitely thought my mom was going to say, like, FaceTime me with her grandchildren. Because I think as anyone who's had the relationship of being simultaneously a daughter and a mom, or a son and a dad, can probably empathize with, I have definitely fallen down the leaderboard of importance in our family, which is totally fair and expected and right. That I know my parents are always wanting to know first what's happening with Charlotte, Aiden, and Jasper. But I will say, one of the great gifts that my kids have given me that I didn't anticipate, and maybe I should have, was really seeing my parents as grandparents. And so while, of course, my mom lifts me up with her gutsiness and her resilience and just her sheer determination to keep making a positive and good contribution to the world, she also lifts me up by being the grandmother that I hope for my kids, because I was really close to my mom's mom and I miss her every day. And just that I now get to see and support my mom as a grandmother is such a tremendous gift that I will always be grateful to my kids for. And she lifts me up by just the amount of love that she gives my children every day.
Oh, well, it's not hard.
That's so nice. Grandmas are the best. It's true.
That is true.
So, Andrea from Delaware says, no questions. I just think you two women are such lovely role models.
Oh.
And she would like to thank you, which I think,
Thank you, Andrea.
That's kind of a story throughout the book, too. It's these women's stories, but I think readers can learn a lot about the two of you, through the lens of these women, which is really cool. And if you would like to buy a signed copy of the book, if you'd like to ask a question, you can go to premiercollectibles.com/gutsywomen. You still got a little bit more time here. Here's a question that I think is it's kind of profound, from Eve in California, who wants to know, how can I raise my son to trust women with power?
Wow, that is incredibly profound. I think you have to raise your son to have a set of values by which he judges people in powerful positions, both men and women. There are leaders who can drive us to the lowest common denominator, the basest of our feelings and emotions, and there are leaders who can lift us up and try to call out a more positive vision of what we're capable of doing. I think our prior president, President Obama, and our current president, President Trump, illustrate those two huge divides. President Obama was always calling us to figure out what we could do together and to come together and to support each other. And our current president is telling us to be afraid of each other and to insult each other. And children absorb those messages. They absorb what the leader, particularly in our country, the president, says and does. And if it's okay for the president to make fun of a person with disabilities, or to insult women, or to be so angry all the time, then it affects how children feel. And the same would be true for women leaders. We have now more women running for president than we've ever had before, and they will get a chance to demonstrate their values as well as whatever ideas and policies they may have. I was very conscious of that when I ran for president, that children were watching, and I talked about the need for more love and kindness in our lives, in our politics, in our country, trying to find ways to cross the divides. It's not easy because, you're a human being. You can get annoyed, you can get frustrated by what people say about you, the lies they tell, and all of that. But it's important, if you're in the public arena, that you do your best to try to model how people are supposed to be treating each other. For me, it's the golden rule, but there's a similar rule in every religion. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat others as you would like to be treated. So I hope that what you do with your son is to try to remove the gender lens and basically say, look at leaders and ask yourself, are they lifting me up or tearing me down? Are they asking me to be hopeful and optimistic or angry and pessimistic? Are they setting a good example for you and others, or is this not the kind of behavior you want in your home or your community? It's a very profound question, and it should be applied to both men and women leaders.
Absolutely. And on a related note, Brandy from Oklahoma says, I am a mother of a 7-year-old daughter who is deeply feminist and wants to be the president so she can fix society. But what one change can she make now to help make her community a better place as a little girl?
Well, I think, Brandy, your 7-year-old knows the answer to that better than we do. You know, what problems does she already see and are already making her angry and frustrated and hopefully then motivated, so that she's not just kind of stewing in that anger and frustration, but is already compelled to try to change that. You know, whether that's something at school or in your neighborhood, or, you know, among her friends. Is she frustrated with how people are treating each other? Is she frustrated by kind of what isn't happening around kind of climate change, if that's really what is a galvanizing issue for her? Does she want kind of more girls to be more visible as leaders already? And I don't know if she's in 2nd grade. I think, you know, probably that's what grade she's in when she's 7. And then what is she going to do about those things? But I think kind of the one change that she can make is a question that she is best situated to ask and answer, and then hopefully you have the great privilege of helping her pursue that answer to then see the change that she's motivated to create.
You know, Chelsea has written 2 books about what kids can do, and she has lots of examples of what kids are doing around the country. They're called, what are the 2 titles?
It's Your World, which is for kind of slightly older kids, but Start Now, which is for kids exactly your daughter's age.
And on the book tour, we were just on the West Coast, we met a young girl who looked to be about 7, 8, or 9, who had started a drive to provide clothes for homeless kids, because in the community where she lived, there were a lot of homeless families. The price of housing is really high. If kids get evicted from their apartment, they often can't quickly get back into another place, and they often don't have warm clothes for winter. And so this little girl heard about that, and she began, I think it was a coat drive, to collect coats for homeless kids in the winter. So it came out of her own experience. She heard something, and she didn't think that was right, and she wanted to do something to help. So I think Chelsea's right to ask your daughter, so, you know, what would you like to do to help somebody? And we've had great examples of kids who come up with their own ideas. You know, there was a little kid in a community not so long ago whose school district said that it was going to deny lunch to kids who hadn't paid their lunch bills. And of course, it wasn't the kids' fault. It was parents who maybe had lost a job or had some other problems that they had failed to pay the lunch bills. And this little kid said, oh, we need to raise money so that no kid goes without lunch. So it was something very particular that came from that child's own experience.
So here's just another comment from Katie in Connecticut, who says, you profiled my cousin Tatiana in your book.
Oh my gosh, yes.
What a lovely surprise for all of us. And so that must be Tatiana McFadden, who of course is an incredible athlete, and her story's in here.
And looking forward to seeing her in the Olympics again next year. I'm already excited about the Olympics.
Who isn't? You know, I think there are women in this book who readers might know their names, may have heard of, but I still think there are, you know, some surprising things to learn about them. But there are also a lot of women in here who, at least for me, I had never heard of. I didn't know about Constance Baker Motley or Rosa May Billinghurst or so many other kind of unsung heroes in this book. And Dana from Michigan wants to know, what character or what woman in the book do you think will surprise your readers the most?
Well, that's a great question. I think it depends on kind of what area or areas you just may not have thought a lot about or had a lot of experience in. So Lauren, I think like the two that you mentioned, Rosemary Billinghurst or Constance Baker Motley, are stories I would argue we all should learn about in school. But I learned about Constance Baker Motley from my mom, and then when I was reminded of her story when I had jury duty here in New York, and I had to report to the Constance Baker Motley room in the court downtown, or I think about Elizabeth Petrovich, who I just am so surprised is not a core part of American history books, because she led the real fight for the first meaningful anti-discrimination law in the United States, passed in Alaska in the 1940s, before even Alaska became a state. More than 20 years before the Civil Rights Act at the federal level. And so, I think some of these stories are surprising, but they shouldn't be. And so I hope that the more they're told, the less surprising they'll become, and the more kind of expected they'll be, whether as part of a school curriculum or just even in conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's see, there are so many good questions in here. If you want to send one in, if you want to get a copy of the book, you can go to premiercollectibles.com/gutsywomen. Chelsea, related to your last answer, Jacqueline in California says, how do we get these books to all the high school young women on a grand scale? This book is a must read.
Well, thank you. Talk to your libraries. I think so many of the stories that I encountered as a little girl that didn't come to me through my mom or my grandmothers or my teachers, I discovered in my library, whether at school or the public library that was across the street from the United Methodist Church that my mom and I went to every Sunday, and where I was lucky enough where after church, literally every Sunday, we would go to the library. So please, talk to your local libraries.
I think the library, it's obviously a favorite place for Chelsea and me. It's where I first encountered Anne Frank and her diary, which I think should be an absolute read in in every school. Because of what it teaches us and how eloquent her description of life hiding from the Nazis was. But I think also this book is a great way to encourage the young people in your life, particularly young women, to read these stories, because we don't want these stories to be lost. We're living in a time when there's so much information and not enough inspiration. And so people don't get the real meat of what could inspire them. So I think there's a lot of ways of getting access to it.
That's a great answer.
Could you pass me my tea, please? Or my hot water? Talking a lot today. Thank you.
So here's one from Colleen in Missouri, who says, as a Girl Scout troop leader, I'm always trying to give my girls a broad range of experiences so that something we accomplish or do will inspire their future careers or endeavors. Were either one of you Girl Scouts, and can you share how Girl Scouts inspired you?
Yes, I was a Brownie, and then I was a Girl Scout, and I ended up in high school as what we called back then a Mariner Scout, because we chose particular areas of interest, and I was really interested in, water or oceans. But we actually highlight the founder of the American Girl Scouts movement in the book because we are true believers in the importance of scouting and those experiences.
And I was a Brownie, and I loved being a Brownie, and I learned so much through that experience. I really learned, I think, how to be part of a team and a strong individual. I learned so much from our early camping experiences. I learned so much through selling Girl Scout cookies. My mom and I frequently talk about kind of make new friends but keep the old. One is silver and the other's gold. It's like just such a great, not only kind of song and melody, but really kind of value. And one of the kind of values that I really absorbed, I think, watching my mom and my grandmother was the importance of friends and friendship. And we were just in Chicago, and it was so great to see so many of my mom's friends that she's had since she was Charlotte, my daughter who's 5's age.
Well, in fact, one of my friends, her mother was my brownie troop leader. You can't make this up. And she and I, even though she's lived her entire adult life in California, she and I have stayed in close touch along with a group of other friends that we went through elementary and high school together. And so scouting was a big part of learning skills and learning confidence, but also making friends and working with adults who really put the best interests of kids first. And I congratulate you for being involved in scouting. And read about Juliet Gordon-Low.
Yeah, she's a fascinating person. I
Totally.
had no idea.
And one of my favorite photographs in the book.
Oh yeah, it's a good one. If you would like to get a copy of the book so you can see that photograph for yourself, you can go to premiercollectibles.com/gutsywomen. Amir Yashar from California asks, how could we use the inspiration from your book, and I really think from these women, to overcome our differences and unite our country?
Oh boy, great. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the real lessons, particularly kind of in the advocates and activists stories, but really throughout the book, is when to know kind of how to find and build upon common ground, and when to kind of stand your ground. Kind of when can you and should you kind of look for places to compromise, but when do you have to just be unrelenting and unflinching and standing up against sexism or racism or homophobia or transphobia or any other kind of form of bigotry. And I think that is just constantly the question that we have to be asking ourselves, particularly now in this moment in our country.
A lot of these women were real pioneers. They encountered a lot of opposition and controversy doing their work or when they were alive, but they persevered, and now we look back and we think, wait, I mean, why didn't everybody just agree with that? Sometimes you do have to be willing to take a lot of incoming heat because you're standing up for something or you're breaking a barrier. And as Chelsea said, though, it's great if you can figure out how to work together. I'll just give you like a couple of examples. So, one of my favorite American women is Eleanor Roosevelt, and I write about her in the book because I think her story is remarkable. She was basically an orphan by a very early age. She was sent off to boarding school, away from family. She really had a lot of challenges that she had to overcome personally, and she kept trying to be, the most effective person she could become. So she did really work to educate herself. She did try to meet different kinds of people, and she became a champion of them. And at the end of her life was one of the people most responsible for drafting something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which lays out what we should be striving for. Regardless of any of the differences among us, we should be striving to recognize and to lift up our common humanity. And she took a lot of incoming grief. People thought she was, too outspoken, or she was, saying and doing things a first lady shouldn't. That sounds a little familiar. And so I find her very, very reassuring and inspirational. And look at the women and girls, young women, on the front lines of the fight for common sense gun legislation right now. Oh my gosh, they are being, Emma Gonzalez is being, attacked and really, maligned online. And she just gets up every day and stands up and speaks out, as do the others. Lucy McBath, who we feature, whose son Jordan was murdered for playing music too loud when he was just a teenager, 17. And Lucy ran for Congress, and she's in Congress, and one of the things she's fighting hardest for is to get better gun laws so that people who shouldn't have guns in the first place to kill and maim or act out of anger or hatred won't. So we think that you've got to stand your ground, but you have to find common ground. And it is a difficult balancing act because we're living in a very polarized world right now. But every one of these women in their own way was trying to do just that.
Well, I'm sorry to say we are just about out of time. I could sit here and listen to the two of you talk about Gutsy Women all day. The next best thing is this book, so I hope you'll go to premiercollectibles.com/GutsyWomen. You can still get a copy. Let's end with this one last question. For each of you, when did you remember thinking, my mom is a gutsy woman?
Oh, that's a great question. When I was a little girl, I didn't really know much about my mother's upbringing, so it wasn't until I was probably a teenager, that I began learning what a difficult and neglectful life she'd had. And I remember asking her, she was basically abandoned by her young parents and then sent to live with her paternal grandparents who didn't treat her very well, and she was out by the age of 13 working as a housekeeper and babysitter in someone else's home. And I remember asking her, how did you survive that? And of course she had to rely on courage and resilience and gutsiness. But you know what she said? She said, at critical points along the way, somebody was kind to me. And I never forgot her saying that because you need some reinforcement. You're out there on the front lines, or you're out there trying to lead a life against difficult odds, or you're struggling with a disease, or you're struggling with some kind of other setback. And just a little bit of kindness can make a big difference to keep that resilience and that optimism going. So it's one of the reasons why I seek out and admire gutsy women in their own lives, as well as the contributions that they make to society.
And I don't think I ever realized my mom was a gutsy woman because it just was such a core part of who she is and always has been to me, Lauren. And so I do remember when I was a little girl and my dad was running for governor of Arkansas. I was 4 and 6 because they used to have 2-year terms. And how often my father's opponents would be attacking my mom, even though she wasn't on the ballot, and just her resoluteness of getting up and leading her life as a mom, as a lawyer, as a kind of advocate and activist. I don't think I quite understood how gutsy that was though until I was older, because it just was who she was and what she was doing.
Well, thank you to Mira and Denmark for that last question. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Again, if you want to pick up a copy of the book, you can go to premiercollectibles.com/GutsyWomen. And I hope you'll come out and see these two on the road in conversation, grab a copy of the book, and spread the word, and, gutsy women forever.
Thank you, Lauren. Thanks,
Be
everybody.
gutsy.